Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event of the book launch series. I would like to thank you all for being here with us today. My name is Grimberg, Golijov, and I'm ALMA's forum coordinator, and it has been a pleasure organizing today's event together with Rosenzweig, the chairman of ALMA. And in today's event, we will present the book, The Justification of War and International Order, edited by Lothar and Hendrik Simon. Before I introduce the speakers, our chairman, Thilo, will say a few words about ALMA.
Thank you, Carolina. I want to thank you all for coming, of course, and I want to thank the speakers for attending. I'm the chairman of ALMA, the Association for the Promotion of International Humanitarian Law, an NGO which is originally stationed in Israel. Our purpose, the purpose of the association is the promotion of the knowledge, discussion, understanding of international humanitarian law. And part of our goals is to do it through different collaborations and cooperations and collaborations. And one of the projects that we are working on right now, that we've been working on in the last few months, is the book launch series on international humanitarian law related books and more public international law which are related to armed conflict books. And the current book that we are dealing with today is definitely one of these books that talked about the justification of war and international order from past to present. And I want to thank the speakers for joining us for this event, and the audience, and of course our Facebook viewers and our future YouTube viewers. So thank you very much, and Carolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then we will move forward with the presentation of the book. Lothar is Senior Professor of Political Science at the Goethe University of Frankfurt and at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. He received his PhD in Political Science from Freie Universität, Berlin in 1973, and his venia legendi habilitation in 1978. He was visiting scholar at University of Texas at Austin, at the Center of European Studies, Harvard University, and fellow at the Center for Global Cooperation Research, Duisburg, and member of the International Review Panel of the National Center of Excellence in Research, North-South Bern in Switzerland. His current academic work focuses on wars of democracies, the relevance of international law in international politics, peace theory, humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and the conditions of cooperation at the international level. English publications include Democratic Wars, Looking at the Dark Side of Democratic Peace, co-edited with Anna Gase and Harald Müller, Hound Mills Palgrave in 2006, Fragile States, Violence and the Failure of Intervention, co-authored with Hans-Henrik Holm, Gog Sorensen, and Michael Stohl, Cooperation in Conflict, Ubiquity, Limits and Potentials of Working Together at the International Level, Ongoing Cooperation and the Human Factor in International Relations. Hendrik Simon, he's a research associate at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt and lecturer at Goethe University Frankfurt. He was visiting fellow at the Center for Advanced International Theory at the University of Sussex, at the University of Vienna, at the Max Planck Institute for the European Legal History in Frankfurt, and at the Cluster of Excellence Normative Orders. He holds a diploma in political science as well as a Magister Artium in International History, both from Frankfurt University. His interdisciplinary research covers international political and legal history and theory, with a particular focus on the justification and critique of war in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. He has published several articles on the topic of the book to be discussed today, including The Myth of Liberum Jus ad Bellum, Justifying the Use of Force in the 19th Century Theory and State Practice in the European Journal of International Law. And furthermore, Hendrik is member of the editorial team of Volksrechtsblog, the leading German language blog on international law and international legal thought. Miloš is professor of European Legal and Constitutional History at Vienna University and was a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna from 2016 until 2020. Habilitation in Legal History, Philosophy of Law, Theory of Law, and Civil Law from Goethe University in Frankfurt, in Frankfurt. Until 2012, he worked at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History and taught there, further teaching at universities of Bonn, Hamburg, Constance, Lyon, Tübingen, and Vilnius. Fellow of the Institute of Advanced Study, Berlin in 2011-2012, Senior Global Hauser Fellow at NYU in 2017, and Associate Member of the Research Center Normative Orders at Frankfurt University. Michael Stohl holds a PhD from Northwestern in Political Science, is a Professor of Communication and Affiliate Professor in the Departments of Political Science and Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Stoll's research and teaching focuses on political and organizational communications and global relations with special reference to political violence, terrorism, and human rights. He is the author or co-author of more than 100 scholarly journal articles and book chapters, and the author, editor, co-editor of 21 books. Dr. Stohl has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including 3 Fulbright fellowships visiting research grants for collaborative research at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, the University of Canterbury and Waikato University in New Zealand, and the Australian National University. In 2008, his article, Networks of Terror, co-authored with Cynthia Stoll, published in Communications Theory in May 2007, was awarded Outstanding Article of the Year by the International Communication Association. He is a Fellow of the International Communication Association. And Thilo Marauhn is Professor of Public Law and International Law at Justus Liebig University, Giessen, Head of the Public International Law Research Group at the Peace Research Institute of Frankfurt, Permanent Visiting Professor at the University of Lucerne, and Adjunct Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He chairs the German National IHL Committee and serves as President of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. His current research interests relate to public international law, focusing on international environmental law, United Nations law, the law of armed conflict, and the sociology of public international law. Now we'll explain the format of the discussion. That will be the following. First of all, the editors of the book, Hendrik, Simon, and Lothar Brock, will give an overview of the book. And then we will have Miloš Beck, Michael Stoll, and Thilo Marauhn that will give an explanation of the chapters written by them. And finally, we will have a Q&A section according to the time remaining. And you're all welcome to submit any questions to the authors in the chat at the Zoom. So Hendrik and Lothar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Idaho, Carolina, for this invitation to present some of the findings of our book, The Justification of War and International Order, from past to present. We want to make use of this opportunity by introducing the general idea of the book and by addressing some of the specific aspects of the topics dealt with in the book. I'm one of the editors of the book, together with Hendrik Simon. While I am in charge of addressing the general idea underlying the book, Hendrik Simon, the co-editor, will follow up with some of his findings on the regulation of the use of force in the 19th century. Then Miloš Beck will address the use of poisonous gas during the First World War and some of the curiosities of the way in which this violation of the jus in bello was handled. Michael Stoll will focus on the justification of the use of force in the war on terror. And finally, Thilo Marauhn will finish up with remarks on the normative standing or the normative authority, if you please, the normative authority of the prohibition of the unilateral use of force under the UN Charter in view of the frequent violations of this provision. We are aware, of course, that our combination of contributors does not really live up to the precept of gender balance, but we felt that this selection of authors from the book comes closest to addressing the links between the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello, which, as we assume, is of special interest to ALMA. You can be assured that the as far as gender is concerned, the book is better balanced than the present panel. With this, let me make some very short remarks on the general idea underlying the book, or underlying actually our work on the book as editors. I begin with a simple, if not banal, question. What is going on in the world today? In the 1990s, we used to deal with this question in terms of progress. Progress towards the establishment of an international rule of law. Nowadays, we tend to think in terms of backlash, the shattering of hopes that an international rule of law can be achieved. In other words, everything seems to be in a state of flux, and that is both exciting but also frightening. One way to cope with the situation and with our standing within this situation is to look at what is happening today from history. And that is what we are trying to do in our book by starting out with early modernity and then follow up the debate on the justification of war to the present. Let me briefly explain how we go about. One of the issues which we're dealing with is that mainstream thinking about our topic has it that in the 19th century, there existed a free right to go to war, which was overcome in the 20th century with the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928, and finally with the UN Charter, which prohibits the unilateral use of force. And here the book by Hathaway and Shapiro on the internationalists comes to mind as an illustration. As Hendrik will explain in a minute, this narrative of progress under the globalization of modernity amounts to an untenable simplification. The roots of post-World War I attempts to legalize the use of force can be found in the entire 19th century. This goes both for the international law of war and the right to go to war. If this is so, what does that imply for dealing with the present? Realists would answer that it would confirm their skepticism concerning the regulation of the use of force in the absence of an international monopoly of power, it is under anarchy. Realists would argue that the longer the history of modern attempts to regulate the use of force gets, the more reason we have to acknowledge the futility of all such attempts. Because then we would have not only 30 or 60 or 80 years of vain hopes to make the modern world a better place for peace, we would have 200 years at least of such vain hopes, all the way from the French Revolution and Immanuel Kant to the present. We, the editors of the book, think the other way around. We are struck by the persistence of a seemingly tacit agreement among political actors all through modern history, if not all through history as such, that the use of force calls for justification and thus is open to rule-based contestation. And this agreement becomes manifest in the formation of communication communities around the issue of the use of force, as one of our authors, Anushka Tisha, explains in the book. And these communication communities are changing in the different historical contexts, but in principle, they keep open the space for the justification and the contestation of the use of force. So instead of looking for backlash in international attempts to foster an international rule of law, we focus on the persistence of efforts to keep up a debate on the justification and the respective contestation of the use of force. There's, as we argue, discontinuity and incoherence in these efforts, but this does not result, as realists would claim, from the anarchical character of the international order and the respective weakness of international law. It rather results from the contradictions inherent in all law. The contradictions in all law as both repression and liberation, as violencia and potestas. So what is needed today is not more skepticism concerning the possibility of change at the international level. What is needed is more reflexivity in dealing with the dynamics of conflict, which implies, as we feel first and foremost, resistance to the mystical manner in which the use of force tends to be justified, be it at the national or the international level. And we hope that our book will contribute to this task. And with this, I turn to Hendrik Simon, my co-editor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lothar. Thanks also to Thilo and Carolina for the kind invitation. Yeah, as hinted by Lothar, we proceed from the assumption that the history of war is also a history of its justification and contestation, both with regard to the decision to go to war and the laws of war. And with this assumption, we challenge mainstream ideas about a transition from a free right to go to war in the 19th century to a rule-based order in the 20th century. In the history of international law, the 19th century is still regarded today as a laissez-faire era for war makers. It is said that while the laws of war, jus in bello, emerged in the middle of the 19th century, the decision to go to war, the jus ad bellum, was a completely arbitrary decision left to each sovereign state. However, looking more closely at the historical sources of the steps taken in the 20th century to regulate the use of force produces evidence that states in the 19th century did not claim a free right to go to war. Rather, this claim was made only by a minority of primarily German lawyers at the end of the 19th century. It was not regarded as an unrestricted competence of governments, as we can read it in most textbooks of international law today. Instead, I argue in my antithesis that the 19th century can be understood as the formative century of the modern normative order concerning the use of force. From the early 19th century onwards, the use of force was tied to the international order created in Vienna by the European great powers after the Napoleonic Wars. This pertains to both jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So now you could ask me what actually was new, and I have 3 short answers today. First, the European Council of Great Powers decided on the admissibility of the use of force to preserve the general European peace. Accordingly, the concert was called in international common power by 19th century international lawyers. And more recently, it has rightly been called the 19th century Security Council by Geneva-based historian Matthias Schulz. Second, the concert prohibited the violent alteration of the territorial order of 1815 by individual states. With this, the prohibition of aggression became an emerging norm over the course of the 19th century. Third, the jus in bello was codified within the concert, especially since the second half of the century. Jus in bello and jus ad bellum were thus parts of a common legal order and not separated, as research has long assumed. So, to a certain extent, one could now say the 19th century was, in a sense, in Immanuel Kant's sense, a century of legalization. Accordingly, in the 19th century discourse of justifying war, we also find references to the norms of the European concert, especially to the general European peace. However, we also find continued references to the oldest European doctrine of justifying war, which is just war. So, does the new order emerging in the 19th century turn out to be an old just war order merely labeled a concert? Well, I do not have the time to answer this question at length here today, but I will only make some brief remarks on the ambivalences and paradoxes of the post-Napoleonic order of the 19th century. So first, legally ordering war in the 19th century was always linked to the interests of the great powers. Accordingly, as German lawyer H.B. Oppenheim in 1845 wrote, the concert was an allied supremacy of the great powers, which sits in judgment over war and peace, but decides according to its very own rules. It served to limit war as well as to legitimize it, whether in colonial warfare outside Europe or in interventions inside Europe. And as Tel Aviv scholars Eyal Benvenisti and Dorian Lustig have argued in the European Journal of International Law more recently, the codification of the jus in bello in the second half of the century served not only to humanize war, but also to monopolize violence among states, for they were to be the sole agents of violence at the international level. Second, because the great powers wanted to be able to smoothly adapt their justifications of war to their interest at any time, war was legalized only to a limited extent. As I said before, the old doctrine of just war remained alive, and so did other normative spheres such as religion, social customs, conventions, morality, history, and honor. So to sum up, the 19th century was a century of the legalization of the use of force, but it was also, to anticipate the concept of our next speaker, Miloš, a century of many normativities that stood in complex relationships to each other. As Lothar has already hinted, these ambivalences complicate the idea of an international rule of law. However, as we try to show within our book, they do not fundamentally destroy this idea. And Miloš, Michael Stohl, and Thilo Marauhn will show in the following inputs how the tension between the rule of law, multiple other normativities, and political arbitrariness emerged in three contexts of the history of war and international order. Thank you.
Thank you, Hendrik and Lothar, for the introduction of the book. And now Miloš will explain chapter 12, Juridification, Politicization, and Circumvention of Law, the Legitimizing Chemical Warfare before and after Ypres.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Ido, for putting this event on ALMA together. Thank you, Lothar, and thank you, Hendrik, for putting me in that volume. So this is a very, very brief summary of what is my particular focus in the history of international law. Don't be afraid when it says there are many slides. I will rush through them and be very superficial, and I won't be able to answer the questions anyway after that, no matter what you ask before, because there is so much unresolved questions because of these entanglements Hendrik just pointed out between law and the other, so to say, realistic powers. So I'm talking about chemical warfare in international humanitarian law, or the law of war around 1900. And as you might know, there has been probably the first chlorine gas attack in the Second Battle of the Flanders at Ypres on April 22nd, 1915, and I'm looking at the justification discourse or the lacking justification discourse here when it is about new weapons. You all know that this World War I was really a battlefield in a multiple sense. Also, it was an experiment with new technologies, and this is Otto Dix, The Flare, a painting from 1917 showing also gas attacks, and you see the skull faces. But it was also a First World War that referred to ideals of morality, chivalry. You see here a man on a horse, but already wearing a gas mask during World War I. So I'm not only interested in the interaction of technology, politics, and law of war, but also in the entanglement between international law, morality, social custom, and take here this gas warfare as an example for it. This is not entirely a historical issue, as you might know. We are still discussing the consequences of chemical warfare, the legal consequences of chemical warfare during the Vietnam War. Now we are discussing Syria in that context. So, but this is a vast and very wild field. When we're talking about the codification of war technologies in international law around 1900, it is clear that this is a series of international regulations, and the promise is mitigation of war through juridification, Verrechtlichung, as we do say in German. The aim of the 19th century was to construct first a European legal order, which then should be, in the second step, a global legal order with all these ambivalences, tensions, paradoxes. And we do see some culminations of these 19th century developments in the Hague conferences, but also some things are lacking in the picture. It is not only universalization, it is not entirely positivistic. There is still a very complicated relation to morality, and international humanitarian law was particularly a very delicate field. It was the field of high politics. Legal internationalism had a problem with national sovereignty. So international humanitarian law is a particularly touchy sphere, and of course the use of violence is not only restricted by international law, but also legitimized. So the development of customary law and treaty law and its principles is very much contested during World War I, and it is, as I said, entangled with other normative orders. This is a very brief list of the legal regulations of the law of war. Thilo Marauhn knows this by far better than me. It is about principles and rules, and here particularly about Article 23. This Article 23 is referring to poisonous weapons explicitly in treaty law, and Article 22 reads as follows: the right of belligerents to adopt means of injuring the enemy is not unlimited. So we do have principles and rules combined here in the field of the law of war. When you look at the discourse prior to 1915, you see many international lawyers are publishing, many treatises, journal articles, review. They are writing about many topics, but and also about poison, but not about gas attacks and chemical warfare. And nobody expected to progress to be so fast. So here I have some famous title pages of international lawyers before 1915, here with the preface from Louis Renaud. And I'll skip this, but just to let you know, they are writing like crazy. They are very happy about these developments. So there is big progress and they can comment on that. Strupp, all these have their very interesting mindsets and histories, and very often very sad histories later on. But I don't want to go into detail. This scenery changes totally in the year 1915 during the use of poisonous gas at the Western Front. The authors of these books are jurists, international lawyers, military officers. The readers are the same. In the years before 1915, scholarship on international law was not very politicized. It was not very nationalized, I would say, and there were in particular no substantial controversies about the interpretation of Article 23. So this picture changes after the first gas attack. International law is, as I put it, alive, but not kicking anymore. So you do have a rich panorama of publications. Look, they are all writing about warfare during World War I, but it's a bit different, and there are quite some limitations. So what is interesting, and what already our colleague from Cornell University, Isabel Virginia Hull, has pointed out, it is totally unclear what the German legal mindset was when they decided to make that gas attack. We do have only ex post justifications, and she questions particularly the German attitudes to international law, but also the other participants, the other nations in World War I did not write immediately official protest notes. The press did not say a lot about this. It was a lot about disinformation and loud silence about the abilities and the use of poisonous gas. What is happening here? I would say there are 3 points to understand this. First of all, there are older traditions about the denial of international law in general, and this is particularly true for some German political fractions. And the military was part of the problem, not of the solution. Secondly, there was a particular dismissal of international law of war. There is a famous pamphlet from the German General Staff from 1902, and it was translated and turned against them during World War I by its enemies. So here you have the Italian cover saying, look at the Germans, they are so cruel. They are deniers of international law, and particularly international humanitarian law. And the third point is, even when the military used the poisonous gas as a weapon, they, I would believe, thought it's a moral taboo to do so, and they were not openly justifying it because it was cruel, unmanly, and against their self-assessment what a warrior should behave like. Another point is visual representations of gas attacks. They are only negative. Nobody is defending gas attacks in literature, in novels, and not visually nowhere. Everybody's only attacking that, whereas you have some kind of heroism of technology when you think about airplanes, flamethrowers, zeppelins, and tanks or so. There is some kind of enthusiasm of modernity. Okay, so here are some more representations of the modernity and cruelty of gas attacks from those years. You might have seen them previously. Okay, this is the third and last part of my presentation. What happens afterwards? We do have an intense international legal debate on the legality. It is a lot about self-justifications from the different nations. There is still, and even stronger than ever, a nationalist polarization when it comes to the interpretation of international law. And in 1925, the Geneva Protocol on Poison Gas is something like a self-reassurance and affirmation of customary international law. So I've been muted by somebody. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
There was some kind of sign. Okay. So the Germans are crazy about gas warfare, as you can see from Google Ngram Viewer. In those years, they're still debating very much what happens there at the Western Front at Ypres, Ypres. And they are writing like mad about what happens during World War I, that they were innocent and everything was fine, more or less. Okay, this is a very, very superficial and a brief summary, and I'm not doing real justice to all these guys, but just to let you know, there is a lot of these interpretations and you can guess what is going on here. So my summary of the whole story is, it is very much about past and present expectations regarding international law. What you see here is the frontispiece of Richard Zauch. He's a British with a French name. Richard Zauch's book, the first monograph on the law between nations, Juris Inter Gentes, and it dates from around 1650. It was immediately translated into German, the first German book saying Völkerrecht. So what I would like to remind you of is that international law is in some sense very old. In another, it is a pretty recent phenomenon. It was only born during the 19th century as an autonomous legal discipline, I would say. And it is very much dependent on its social environment, so to say. And this environment was, during the years of World War I, highly militarized, politicized, nationalistic, and it did not work as we as 20th century academic citizens would hope it would have worked. Instead, the enforcement of the norms, these norms were faced with their circumvention and even denial of international law. Realpolitik trumped the law of war during and after World War I. However, maybe we can be comforted with the impression that the scandals helped to reinforce the norms. This is why we are here and where I end, and I have only one last final iconic image for you. Many thanks.
Thank you, Miloš. Now we will move forward with chapter 17 by Michael Stohl, which is on the war on terror and the law of war, shaping international order in the context of irregular violence. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I too would like to thank Lothar and Hendrik for the invitation to contribute to the volume, and Ido, Carolina, and Alma for the opportunity to share it with you. My chapter explores how 9/11 altered the constructions of the threat of terrorism and how these constructions in turn affected arguments and justification for the use of force in the context of counterterrorism. I conclude that the construction of terrorism as an existential threat shattered the long, hard development of jus ad bellum and jus in bello norms and law. Now, let me begin by talking about terrorism itself. Long before 9/11, E.V. Walter had argued that the reactions to a terrorist event are far more important for understanding the consequences of a terrorist attack than the original action. The power of the terrorist event is shaped by how policymakers and publics react to the events, and these reactions are far more important than the number of victims. This is the case for the attacks of 9/11 as well, even though they were far more horrendous and shocking than many other terrorist attacks. And as the last 19 years have sadly demonstrated, the choices set in motion in the immediate aftermath of the attacks were disastrous in the long run, but not only the United States, but also peace and security across the Middle East and Southwest Asia, as well as the normative foundations of international order. So in the chapter, I argued that a core component of the new construction was the creation of the war on terror. The chapter also explores how this further altered arguments for and justifications of the use of force in counterterrorism at home and abroad. National state responses and increased fear of further attacks reinforce the persistence of a Westphalian interstate system and the central role of sovereignty claims within the global governance regime. This tilted the balance that had existed within most democratic national states between law enforcement approaches for domestic threats and armed responses for international threats towards the war side of the approach. As the years have passed, it has also been claimed that these changes were inevitable. However, the decisions that were taken in the immediate aftermath of the attacks were not the only possible reactions. Those decisions, including declaring the war on terror, passing the Patriot Act, and going to war against Afghanistan, for example, were all assertive choices by the United States, and they were joined in the international arena by most members of NATO and the United Nations, or mirrored by other nations in the legislative and administrative decisions that they made on their domestic fronts. They were not inevitable or necessary. Even more consequential for the norm-shaping international order was the war against Iraq. A core component of the new construction was the declaration of the war on terror, which elevated terrorism to an existential threat. The rhetoric and construction of the rationales that followed reflect this change in the evaluation of the threat of terrorism. Widespread national responses to the attacks in the context of this new, quote, reality resulted in a much increased fear of further attacks and their possible consequences. These claims and responses shattered the norms that had developed in response to the failures to prevent war over the previous century and how to treat combatants and non-combatants in the aftermath of those failures. This norm shattering helped alter the common understanding of what war in general is about, how it is justified, and how it should be fought. That this was not inevitable was made clear as early as 2003 by Harold Coe, who argued that Mr. Bush could have employed the then existing multilateralist strategy and could have employed the symbolism of standing in solidarity with the world's ambassadors at the United Nations. He could have supported the International Criminal Court as a way of bringing Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein and others to justice. Obviously, he did not. The war on terror approach created a frame that emphasized attacking the perpetrators and their supporters and was intended to demonstrate not only the strength of the response to this threat, but also that the Bush administration was not going to rely on what they characterized as the soft and restrained law enforcement approach of their predecessors. Now, there have been numerous discussions as to why the war metaphor is counterproductive, both as a rhetoric and tactical strategy for counterterrorism. Scholars, pundits, and even serving military leaders have argued that the war metaphor undermined the ability of the United States to manage the problem of terrorism. In July 2005, for example, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff noted, "I've objected to the use of the term war on terrorism because if you call it a war, then you think of people in uniform as the solution. The long-term problem is as much diplomatic, as much economic, in fact, more diplomatic, more economic, more political than it is military." Now, on his first day in office, President Obama fulfilled a key campaign promise and issued a series of executive orders designed to distance the new administration from Mr. Bush's strategy and to demarcate a new approach to confronting terrorism. One announced is based on law enforcement principles. And these included the closure of the CIA's secret prisons, requiring the CIA to abide by the same interrogation standards as the military, revoking past presidential directives that authorized abusive treatment of prisoners, and reaffirming U.S. adherence to the Geneva Conventions. And over the next few weeks, Mr. Obama named the global war on terrorism to the much less elegant and forceful sounding phrase of overseas contingency operations to signal the shift in military, legal, and intelligence approaches that he adopted. However, these changes, while they challenge some of the political narrative that had been established in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 did not question the mainframe that 9/11 had changed everything, and as has been frequently commented upon by civil libertarians who were quite disappointed with Mr. Obama and his Justice Department. Much of the legal architecture and reasoning with respect to the Bush administration legacy, not enough was truly reconceived. Nonetheless, Mr. Obama was immediately attacked from the right for weakening the United States and opening the homeland to attack. And that further, that he was not prepared to fight the existential threat that terrorism posed. But even more consequentially, while Mr. Obama challenged the war on terror metaphor, he did not challenge the notion of the global network of terror which accompanied it, and thus inadvertently, he reinforced the war on terror's metaphorical underpinnings. So for example, in January 2010, Mr. Obama said, "We are at war. We are at war against Al-Qaeda, a far-reaching network of violence and hatred that attacked us on 9/11, that killed nearly 3,000 innocent people, and that is plotting to strike us again, and we will do whatever it takes to defeat them." Now, this was not merely an American problem. The American framing was adopted by numerous governments, particularly when it was politically convenient, and some nations even competed to have their terrorists included in the US global network of terror. Now, prior to 9/11, the US privileged the rule of law at home and put domestic law enforcement, federal and local, and principally the FBI as the locus of control in these approach. A parallel approach characterized the United States abroad. Notwithstanding the numerous breaches of international law, for example, the bombing of Libya in 1986 or the cruise missile attacks on Iraq in 1993, the 1993, I should say, the rhetoric and basic approach of the United States at the international level was respect for the rule of law abroad and respect for international cooperation and institutions that had been built after World War II. The Bush administration, however, challenged the established jus ad bellum and jus in bello principles that had developed. And prior to 9/11, the prevailing opinion was that unless terrorist attacks were attributed to a state through state agents or clear sponsorship, the conditions necessary for the legitimate use of force as laid out in Articles 39 to 42 of the UN Charter were outside the Security Council's purview. And further, that anticipatory self-defense and reprisal was still outside the scope of permissible actions. After the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration argued that these principles should no longer be operative in either the jus ad bellum or jus in bello spheres. In the aftermath of 9/11, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted UNSC 1368, which called for steps to respond to the attacks and combat all forms of terrorism in accordance with the Charter. It was particularly significant because it linked Article 51's right to self-defense with the response to international terrorism. Shortly thereafter, the Security Council also passed 1373, which required member states to criminalize terrorism and its financing and provided guidelines for enhanced cooperation on law enforcement and intelligence sharing. This was the first time that a Chapter 7 resolution imposed a legal duty on states to introduce specific kinds of domestic counterterrorism legislations. These were followed in October with American airstrikes against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, and in December by UN Security Council Resolution 1386, authorizing the establishment of the International Security Assistance Force for Afghanistan, led by NATO. Now, Thomas Frank has argued that these actions transformed the previous understood jus ad bellum arguments restricting the right to exercise self-defense against terrorists and other non-state attacks, with the result that such assertions of self-defense rights were no longer concerned with attributing the attacks to another state, and with the acquiescence of the international communities, he claimed these claims are no longer exceptional claims. And after the invasion of Iraq, Frank declared a much more troubling set of conclusions concluding himself, what is remarkable is that once obligatory efforts by the aggressor to make a serious effort to stretch law to legitimate state action have given way to a drive to repeal law altogether, replacing it with the principle derived from the Athenians at Miloš, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they most. The invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 and policy statements made concurrently by the United States have succeeded in changing all that. Article 2.4 has died again, and this time perhaps for good. Now, before September 11th, further, the prevailing view was that the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols which address problems arising from insurgent groups in civil war had achieved what Marauhn had described as universal acceptance of the conventions and their secure integration into the international system, and that most of those provisions were recognized as customary law and often as jus cogens. Nonetheless, the Bush administration chose to violate its legal responsibility. And while the United States initiated the post-9/11 assault on the applicability of international humanitarian law, it was not only in the United States activities under the cover of UN's Security Council Resolution 1373 led to violations of human rights that subsequently detailed by the UN Counterterrorism Committee, as well as many scholars and activists. Arguments for security and political fear, and that the appearance of not having acted with strength or resolve to protect the state also led many Western countries to abandon their duties with respect to human rights abroad and at home. One significant breach of norms is encapsulated in the term extraordinary rendition. We now know that at least 54 nations participated in some manner in the extraordinary rendition program, and that the program hadn't ended well into the Obama administration, despite the announcements regarding the return to respect for international law that was proclaimed on Mr. Obama's first day in office. So I also talk about drones in the chapter, but for time's sake, I'll just mention that obviously drones have resulted in the killing of large numbers of civilians, many of whom were classified as combatants, even though that was not legal under international law, a stretching of the conditions. And thus, all told, 9/11 altered the construction of the threat of terrorism, and these constructions in turn affected arguments and justifications for war, both declared and not. And it did, as Lothar mentioned earlier, shattered well-established norms of international law and common understandings of what war in general is about and against whom it may be fought. It is time that the world community address these changes and try to build back what needs to be accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And now we will move forward with chapter 25 by Thilo Marauhn on how many deaths can Article 2.4 of the UN Charter die.
Thank you very much, Ido and Carolina, for inviting me to this event, and thank you to Lothar and Hendrik for inviting me to participate in the book. My chapter takes as a starting point a famous essay written by Thomas Frank and published in 1970, Who Killed Article 2.4. My chapter takes Frank's analysis in light of his 2003 critique a few steps further. So a number of years, 33 years after his first essay, Thomas Frank published a short critique called The United Nations After Iraq, and in this critique he discusses current trends in the justification of violence, and Michael Stohl has just referred to some of this. My chapter reaffirms Frank's critical view of international practice in light of normative standards and warns against weakening the prohibition of the use of force. This prohibition, my chapter argues, should stand as a cornerstone of public international law, as an expression of the rule of law, and to quote Martti Koskeniemi, in support of international law as a gentle civilizer. Drawing upon developments from political practice as well as on legal debates, my chapter calls upon lawyers, not the law, lawyers, to live up to their responsibility and to defend the counterfactual dimension of the law. And this counterfactual dimension of the law, I think, is of pressing importance and has been of pressing importance throughout history. The law never works by itself. The law always requires people to argue the law. It requires a certain societal background in which the law is actually accepted as an argument, and it necessitates something that goes beyond the belief in formal institutions, because we do not always have the institutions that we wish to have. And this is what I take up in my chapter. I do so by calling upon Thomas Frank for a number of reasons. I think his essay and his personality bring together several issues which I would like to point out. It is not just the law, which he carefully analyzes in his essays, but it is also the responsibility of lawyers, which he actually points out. I do so by looking at the relationship between international relations and international law, in discussing what is the current state of the prohibition of the threat and use of force. Second, I take up the question, what is the relationship between a normative claim and state practice in this particular context? And third, I raise the question how the detachment of international peace and security from the United Nations can be prevented. And I conclude by taking up the question which Thomas Frank has already raised, namely, what is the proper role for the lawyer in this particular context? When we look at the state of Article 2.4, we actually can identify at least three areas in which Article 2.4 is strategically weakened. The first is based on what a number of our fellow academics might believe is something that strengthens the prohibition of the use of force, and that is interpreting Article 2.4 in a broad manner, including as much as possible in Article 2.4. This relates to the term force. It relates to the application of the provision to situations like cyber or to other situations. I do not want to go into detail for reasons of time, but I think it is very important to stress that well-meant, extensive interpretations of the prohibition of the use of force may be to the actual detriment of such a rule. The second element, which I would like to point out, is the extent to which reference to the right of self-defense weakens the prohibition. Indeed, there is a close interrelationship between Article 2.4 and Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, one prohibiting the use of force, the other actually looking at the right of self-defense. Where do we have actually a number of issues there? One is a fairly old one, which Thomas Frank already addressed in his two papers, and that is the right to preventive self-defense. And if we look at a number of developments over recent years, this right to preventive self-defense has always played a very important role in justifying more force rather than less. And this refers to unilateral use of force, not to collectively legitimized or authorized use of force. A third element, and this has become particularly pertinent in recent years, is the trend to actually broadly interpret enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Now, at first sight, again, this looks as actually supporting the prohibition of the use of force. But if we look a little bit closer at this and at the various issues, some of them have been taken up by Michael Stohl and others in this panel discussion. A reference to to Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter by itself does not legitimize every kind of the use of force. The United Nations Security Council is a political body that actually pursues political objectives. And I just want to point out that last year, when the resolution on COVID-19 was adopted by the United Nations Security Council, there was an exception integrated in this resolution with regard to the desired armistice. And this exception actually referred to non-state actors. So non-state actors, fighting non-state actors that were suspected of terrorism or other activities, they were excluded from the scope of the desire of both of the UN Security Council with regard to such armistice developments. Now, if we take these three elements, three weakenings of Article 2.4 and try to develop an argument on this basis, I think there is some prospect actually to work towards the importance of counterfactual normative claims. As Miloš has mentioned in his presentation, a lot of the debate about the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons was not on whether or not this is a watertight prohibition. That was not the issue. It was about presenting arguments. And the arguments were presented in different ways, before the First World War, during the First World War, and after the First World War. And one of the issues with all of international law, irrespective of how we actually define the legal character of international law, is that it is about arguments. And arguments are presented by one side, by another side, and perhaps by a third side. And these arguments may not look as actually the drafters of the Charter perceived the world they wanted to have, namely a world without resort to war. But these arguments provide guidance in a world which actually pursues different interests. And in actually implementing this guidance, it is the responsibility of lawyers in discourse with other disciplines, with political decision makers, to actually present these normative counterclaims in light of the practice they actually see. I've discussed this very same idea in a different book, which was edited by Georg Nolte and others, the new German judge at the International Court of Justice. And in this book, I argued that very often arguments of legitimacy are put forward rather than focusing on legality issues. And it is not legitimacy that can be achieved by putting forward these arguments, but it is just a different kind of looking at things, of presenting your own arguments. So if we take Article 2.4 seriously, then this is not a watertight barrier against all types of force that may be used in international relations, but it provides a counterfactual claim within times where often orientation is rather difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thilo. And now we will move forward with the Q&A. So I will start with a question in the chat, but everyone is welcome to write any questions. So from Harut Ekmanyan, he asks, what do the panelists think of the current regime of outlawing war as means of dispute settlement in light of the recent unprovoked war of choice by Azerbaijan against Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia? If Hendrik, Lothar, do you want to start? Or
Lothar, willst du?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is actually a question for Thilo, but perhaps I will just start with pointing out that from my perspective, neither Azerbaijan nor Armenia can really refer to Article 51 in this context, but they were bound to the obligation prior to Article 51 of the armistice, and so the political question maybe would be that this is also a failing of the international community, because the European Union would be an actor to actually go a step further and supporting the Minsk group, in my point of view. But yeah, just to take the thesis that neither party can refer to Article 51 in this context. But I'm thrilled what Thilo has to say from an international legal background.
If I may, I can just add a few remarks. Hendrik, I would agree with most of what you actually said. The situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan is often perceived in a very subjective manner, depending on our own perceptions, who we actually support in this dispute. If we look at the facts are very complex and not easy to put into one box. And there is indeed the big question whether or not there was an ongoing conflict between the two powers that actually has already been brought to had already been brought to a halt by an armistice agreement and others. And then the question actually arises how this actually broke out into new fighting. But many of these legal questions seem to point into very technical issues, which I believe the law as such can help to moderate, but in actually finding a peaceful solution for the relationship between the two states, much more is needed than just the law. And this is, I think, one of the really good examples where you can see the limited impact of 2.4 on the one hand and 51, not because the norms, the rules are stupid or not meaningful, but because they are used for different purposes by the various actors involved. And the actors involved are not just Armenia and Azerbaijan, to conclude this. Thank you.
Michael, Miloš, or Lothar, do you want to add something?
Well, one could perhaps say that if you know that a war has been outlawed as a means of dispute settlement, there's a general prohibition of the use of force under Article 2.4. Thilo Marauhn has been talking about that at length, and so that would mean that in such a situation, there's no way of legitimating the attack on the part of Azerbaijan against Nagorno-Karabakh, because it was not in the immediate situation, there was no self-defense involved. But on the other hand, of course, I mean, that refers to Thilo Marauhn's remarks on how do you put the argument. And that's, of course, a touchy issue for lay people who look at international law, lay people like me. Azerbaijan managed to put the argument the other way around, saying, well, the general situation is one of attack on our rights by Nagorno-Karabakh. They have been, disrespecting their being part of Azerbaijan, and this situation has to be taken up somehow. So, I wonder, what does your argument about putting an argument mean in such a situation? I mean, how do you deal with this, the justification of the war by Azerbaijan, and there was a legitimation or justification. And of course, I mean, on the other side, Karabakh, who could claim that they were acting in self-defense. Is that an attack on Article 2.4 in your understanding? Miloš?
Slightly more complex than you suggested in pointing out to the military activities of Azerbaijan against Armenia. One of the big issues there is whether indeed the situation before the renewed start of the fighting, and this is now very technical stuff, actually amounted to a situation of the absence of force, or whether it was just a kind of intermediate situation, an armistice, not peace, between the two countries. If it had been peace, there would have probably been a need for a much more solid settlement. So in that sense, I believe that the situation which is currently looked at is rather difficult. And then we would have to go historically back to the first or to earlier hostilities between the two countries, which again complicate the situation. I think what the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan makes pretty clear is that if you leave such situations unresolved without actually addressing the underlying causes of the conflict, I think no proper and stable solution can be achieved. And we will have to wait and see what will actually come out of the current situation, because that again has not resolved a conflict. It has only brought about an end of certain hostilities, but not more. So I'm fairly skeptic and reluctant to actually see either responsibility one way or the other, nor to actually address this issue in terms of bringing about peace. So the law has been used in very subjective ways by both parties to the conflict, and the long history which we actually looked at. And I again would like to point to Miloš, because I think that is what we learn by historical approaches to international law, is that we actually can only understand these issues if we take a historical perspective into this. The other is, again, I think there is more good news in prohibiting the use of force than in justifying the use of force, but this is something that needs to be put forward in arguments.
So do you have any more comments, or if not, I will move forward? Okay, so we have another question. The question is, it would be interesting to receive any of the panelists' point of view as of the possible development of a new justification to the use of force, except for Article 51, for example. Do you expect the justification on the basis of intervention develop further?
This is a question for Miloš and Lothar, because when you say this is a new justification, Miloš could tell you now that humanitarian intervention is not really a new justification narrative, but actually goes back at least to the 19th century. And Lothar could say something about the possible emergence of responsibility to protect, but I think you see it rather critical. So maybe, Miloš, you could say some sentences about the 19th century background, and Lothar, you could say something about R2P and the younger developments.
Thank you, Hendrik. I really feel flattered by your remarks and also what Thilo Marauhn said about the use of history and historical perspective to resolve conflicts. But of course, I mean, as a legal historian, I must say it's really complicated, and I'm not sure if history will satisfy your requests with clear answers. I mean, there has no conflict been in the past where history not has been an argument for both sides, of course. So it's very complicated to get a straight answer to any conflicts by looking at history. Historical titles have always been very important to political claims, to international legal claims. So it's very delicate to expect history to be helpful. Maybe it's even worse, and history is confusing. But this is why we are doing it. I mean, we are always telling the past in different narratives and different perspectives. And we add not only from time to time new sources, now by GPS data or archaeology or so, but we also supply new narratives about the past, and past looks immediately really different. But this is a general remark, and I am only inclined to make another general remark to your question, which is the Italian lawyer Carnazza Amari said already in the 19th century, the one and only true sentence that there is no such disputed question in international law as the question of intervention. Because this is about balancing international community with state sovereignty. And that is what we are constantly negotiating and discussing. If you think about all these very delicate cases, wherever things are happening in the world and we think this is unbearable, this is a moral scandal, this is a violation of human rights or so, it's not easy to say what the appropriate measures are and what their cost will be. You know, I'm here as a legal historian, and therefore I refrain to say something about the current political conflicts and their costs and their dark sides. I can say only about something about, you know, historical sources and rereading them or so. Apologies if this does not satisfy your expectations you have when you look at the work of historians, but it is like that for me at least. I mean, I would, in a certain way, be inclined to separate international legal history from the politics of international law here, and to be pretty careful.
But of course, we agree that the politics of international law have also to do with the way the history of international law is being told. So I think that's one of your theses. But Adi, one could say two things. The first one is actually intervention has become relatively, in relative terms, more important since 1945 and at least since 1990 in international politics in comparison to war. Recently, a book has come out which shows that no country is willing to admit anymore that they are organizing in war, that they're waging war. They just admit that they are intervening in a certain situation. And so one could argue that intervention is becoming much more important than it used to be as a tool of international politics. And On the other hand, as far as humanitarian intervention is concerned, which Hendrik referred to, there was a high time of argument or arguing for humanitarian intervention in the 1990s, as there was in the 1890s. In the 1990s, the idea was that there are rogue countries where human rights are grossly violated, and we can just not just stand there and look, stand by without doing anything. So we have to do something, and what we have to do is, if necessary, intervene. And in the first half of the 1990s, it was possible to intervene in certain cases under Chapter 7 decisions of the Security Council, United Nations Security Council. After 1995, this was not possible anymore because there was disagreement between the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, on issues of intervention. So the task came up, or the question came up, can we in such situations intervene without Security Council authorization? And that was a big fight going on between 1995 and 1999, the war in Kosovo. And then the United Nations came up with the idea, or a group of experts came up with the idea of a responsibility to protect. And this responsibility to protect confirmed the need for the international community to react to gross violations of human rights, but only under certain conditions. And so the general reading was then international community should care about gross violations of human rights in certain countries. First, by reminding the country that it has a responsibility to protect its citizens. Secondly, by helping the country to live up to the responsibility. And only in the case that the respective country is unwilling or unable to shield their own population from these gross violations of human rights, the international community may intervene. But it has done so by vaguely referring to this responsibility to protect in the case of Libya in 2011. But that turned out to be a real disaster because in the end, the population was not protected from gross violations of their human rights, but actually the violence expanded and the civil war went on. And this was taken by the African Union, by the Soviet Union, by China as an argument to say, we don't want to hear anything about humanitarian intervention in the case of Syria. And so they blocked every attempt to address the case of Syria as an object of international humanitarian or other intervention. So the situations are rather complicated, and one should say that the responsibility to protect, which is the responsibility of the international community to care for what is happening in different countries, is not dead, but to use Miloš's term, it is still alive, but it is not really kicking. There's a lot of caution on both sides, the sides of the liberal democracies, as much as on the part of the African Union or other countries.
May I add an historical argument to your statement, Lothar,
yeah.
Which is my colleague from Munich has written in his habilitation a global history of the intervention in the 19th century. His name is Fabian Klose, and
yeah.
The title is In the Cause of Humanity. And he shows with examples from 4 continents that humanitarian intervention was always connected with power politics and particularly colonialism and imperialism in the 19th century. So therefore, we feel historically very much uncomfortable when we ask for intervention, because we know about the emergence, so to say, in international relations and also in international legal doctrine of that concept. It's somehow tainted. It is very often a pretext for other things. So, and this is very complicated to judge. I mean, when Lothar says it's about the conditions, the formula of conditions refers to facts, and facts are very complicated. I mean, we don't believe in the age of post-truth, but still, what are facts is not very easy to say in many cases. So it remains very complicated, and this is only for the past. I don't say anything about the future.
But what you were saying about the skepticism concerning the past is now also prevalent with a view to the present. And Michael actually is dealing with the same issue in a way when he refers to the war on terror and the arguments put forward there.
Okay, so there is a follow-up question. Adi, if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for, I didn't have the occasion to say, thank you very much for this interesting and interesting topic, and neglected, that is mostly neglected in international writing. So that was very interesting. Thank you for that. Just as a preliminary comment, first of all, regarding to the legal historians, I mean, the best prophet of the future is the past. So I'm in any assessment of what will become in the law, I think actually the legal historians have a huge part to play in. My follow-up question, especially if I may, is obviously, I mean, intervention always existed, but my question is, for example, if intervention as we see it today might develop even further. For example, people speaking about the war of about the international crime of against the environment, whether a state might use, not for international aspect, but a state might use that, and I'm not negating the cynicism in which it will be used, but the fact it will be used as justification for intervention. Do you expect to see in the next century or so some kind of different kind of intervention, or even a different form of self-defense, not the one we used to under the classic Article 51, but something that it's completely different. It was never used in the past in that sense before. Thank you.
Actually, there was a debate in the early 1990s whether the military should be used in order to prevent large-scale forest fires. Of course, the argument was we will help them, to control the fires. But by now we know that these fires, some of the politicians don't want these fires to be controlled. And this was a case was debated or hinted with a view to Brazil and Indonesia. Indonesia, where you have forest fires which will cloud the entire region for months. So these arguments have come up in the past, but I think, and I would agree with Miloš on this account, that there's more skepticism at the moment on these issues than there was in the early 1990s.
If I may, I would like to add a few remarks. I think what is important, both with regard to the idea of humanitarian intervention, with regard to the responsibility to protect, and with regard to other objectives that may be pursued, such as environmental protection, or we can think of many other issues. I think one of the special things about the prohibition of the use of force is that it is a rule that actually addresses a mode of actually addressing conflict. It is not so much a substantive rule that addresses our common values or something like that. It is a very formal rule, and the advantage of both the Briand-Kellogg Pact and the United Nations Charter. But I would also argue the advantage of a little bit of formalizing, or as Miloš would put it, the juridification of this rule, is that it has moved from a rather substantive issue to a more formal issue. And treating the prohibition of the use of force in a more formal way, I think, is one of the issues that will ensure the survival of mankind, among others. If we only look at justifications for the use of force in a substantive manner, if we only say, oh, we have the better values, then we will not grasp the very specialty of the prohibition of the use of force that has emerged in the 20th century. While I fully agree with everything that has been put forward in a historical perspective, I think that whether or not we look at this rule in a formal or in a substantive way is very important when it comes to how we ensure our survival. And if you look at protecting human dignity, or if you look at the responsibility to protect, there's always a lot of time, a lot of opportunities to actually protect human rights and other civilian interests beforehand. But very often states omit a lot of possibilities to actually do that. They wait too long, and it's our responsibility also as members of the civil society to point out that there is a need for early action and not for late action. If it is late action, then often only very few instruments are left, and these may not be the best for all of us.
Thank you, Thilo. And unfortunately, we ran out of time, so I'm going to finish the event here. And to conclude, I want to thank you, Lothar, Hendrik, Miloš, Thilo, and Michael for this very interesting discussion. And I also want to thank Ido for organizing this event with me, and to all the viewers that joined us today. We will soon update you with information regarding our next event of the book launch series. And I encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook and subscribe us to our mailing list in order to receive all our news. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.